Welcome, everyone, to another episode of HR and Payroll 2.0. I'm Pete Tiliakis, and as always, I'm joined by the legendary Julie Fernandez. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks, Pete. And I'm really looking forward to you telling us about our next guest, Catey.
Yes. My good friend, Catey Palmer. Catey and I have been pen pals on LinkedIn and elsewhere for a while now. She is no doubt the energizer bunny of the global payroll world. She is a global mobility expert and the new founder of ExPaytriate. Miss Catey Palmer, I'm so happy to have you here. I don't think I'd ever find anybody with my energy level in this space, and I found you. So,
hello. It's an absolute honor. I feel like a bit of a rock star being on this.
Oh, you are.
You are.
You already are. That's why you're here.
I honestly, because the people that have been on this, and I've listened to these podcasts for ages, so I'm really honored to even be
Good.
on
You're a
them.
long-time listener. We appreciate you. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Catey, you know, as a long-time listener, that I get the privilege of asking the fun stuff up front. And I'm always intrigued to know, how on earth did you get into HR payroll? And then, of course, what makes you stay?
Yeah, so I've had a really different journey to most payroll or HR or GM professionals. So when I finished my degree, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. Had an opportunity to go and become a lawyer. I had a training contract. Decided, I wanted to be a human rights lawyer when I was younger. But that's really hard to do. And I went to an interview. A Magic Circle firm. I don't know if you guys know, it's called Linklaters. Really, really big firm.
Yeah.
And I was absolutely terrified at this experience. And they had the most beautiful restaurants and beds and all sorts in the office. So I was like, right, even at a 21-year-old, I was like, so that means I will probably never see my home.
Yep.
And I will kill myself. Yes, I'll get a nice, healthy salary.
Yeah.
But at the expense of my health, my sanity, my life. So then I decided, oh, no, don't want to do that. And I spent 8 months living in Amsterdam when I was 21, doing a big project for a company called Health Action International, which was closely aligned to the World Health Organization. So I did a really exciting project for them and presented at the European Parliament down in Brussels. Amazing, right?
Yeah.
For a 21-year-old graduate, love that. And that's when I started going, wow, okay. So I was living overseas for 8 months and I had student loan and then I realized I actually had tax and social security issues and had to work out, what do I need to do with my student loan and all these sort of things. And when I got back to the UK, I was like, I have all these things and letters from the HMRC. So then I was like, oh, okay, I'll sort all that out. And I sorted it out myself. It was fine. And I was like, well, that's actually quite complicated. So then I got headhunted into EY, Ernst & Young, into human capital tax. And I wasn't expecting to love that. Wow. I was dealing with expat tax. I was working with Sally Hair and Beauty, the CEO of Sally Hair and Beauty, and Microsoft as my client. Wow. And I quickly loved dealing with US tax as well. And I was like, wow, tax. And I did politics and sociology at university. So they didn't, and honestly, maths was never my thing. I mean, I got an A, but it was never something I would ever imagine going down to. But then I decided I'm not really a Big Four type person, but I love the technical side of the tax, the complexities working overseas, but also the people side of solving complex problems for people and companies. So then I took some time out of that and wanted to reestablish what I wanted to do. So then I was chatting in Brighton, which is down the south coast of England.
Yep.
In a coffee shop. And I was talking to my best friend about, you're 22, what are you going to do with your life and all these sort of things. And I had all these ideas and aspirations of what I wanted to do. And it's people, it's tax, it's problem solving, it's strategy, policy, all that great stuff. And I was like, well, how on earth do you find all that in one role? And this lady, Tessa Mason, who's still a really good friend of mine, and she'll probably listen to this actually, or she will. She was like, Catey, do you mind? Because she heard my name. She said, can I just propose a an idea to you. And she had a role in Richmond, which is in the sort of south part of London. And they need a global mobility advisor to come in and help establish policies, processes. They're working with the big four. And, that's it. So I was like, well, I went to the interview. Hands down, one of the best companies and best roles I've ever done in my life. And I was there. It was a little management consulting called Celerant Consulting. And I got to go into the payroll, the domestic, the global payroll, the expats. I worked with PwC at the time, who were great. And I loved everything to do with the mobility piece, but the complexities around the social security, expenses, benefits, everything. And I got to manage the whole thing. And it was fabulous. And then that was kind of my platform, if you like, to work both in industry and in professional services. And that's what I've done. And I've managed global payrolls. I've managed global mobility functions. I've worked across the tax teams, the HR, the mobility, finance. So I've learned the challenges and the opportunities to get the best from all those different functions within a business and how complicated that is and how to navigate that landscape. But also I've now shaped my career in the past sort of 4 years to be able to say, right, what do I want to do? Well, ultimately, I want to be my own boss. And I want to create a business that's focused around expat payroll compliance, global payroll, domestic, but helping small companies, startups, scale-ups with the opportunity to establish key knowledge around payroll, HR, employment taxes, and not at the expense of paying astronomical amounts of fees.
Yeah.
The top firms, because then it's a barrier to being compliant. So it's not that a lot of these companies don't want to, but when they start seeing, well, that's going to be 10 grand, 20 grand.
Yeah.
And do you know what I mean? And they're starting up and that's their growth money. So then they go, well, I'll go into Google,
Yeah.
a bit of Wikipedia, and I'm sure that'll be fine.
Yeah.
That will manage all my compliance. No problems whatsoever. And a little Excel spreadsheet to go and manage, your payroll in France or whatever. No problem. Absolutely no risk
Ask
at all.
ChatGPT. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that will tell you everything, right? Brilliant.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, AI, brilliant. And actually, if you aren't going to take that on board, you're kind of dead in the water.
Yeah.
You really have to embrace
So,
it.
Catey, it sounds like you were able to have it all, right? I mean, you talked about it has it all, right? I mean, all the things you listed, you found in payroll. You went from watching paint dry to paint being spilled, I guess. Some would say that about tax is watching paint dry. It's like the same pain. But for you, I think you have a different lens and you see something more wonderful than the others do.
Sure, and you got to stay. You just created your own dream combination of chaos, right?
And it's so exciting. And then you can also, because within ExPatriate, because I love supporting other businesses grow and develop, there's lots of strategic partners on there around payroll, wellness, fitness. You guys are on there, lots of payroll leaders to showcase that there's lots of people out there willing to help and willing to give you that knowledge if you're willing to ask for it.
Yeah.
And lots of great new technology vendors out there that are really delivering absolutely exceptional service and listening to their clients and taking the feedback and creating their roadmap, which you can really buy into. Because you're like, right, that's aligned to legislation. That's aligned to what my clients need.
Yeah.
Technology.
Catey, one of the things that I think back when I was leading payrolls or even when I was doing due diligence with big enterprises that had gnarly, because that's where most of the expats tend to be. I was always scared of it. It always it terrified me. I always had great folks running it and I stayed very close and involved, but it just scared me to death. Like I just didn't want anything to go wrong. And there's so much it felt like could go wrong. And we had to work very closely with our partners and management audit and all of that to deal with it. But it was so complicated. And back then, we didn't have the systems that we have today. But I mean, one of the things that I've seen you talk about online on LinkedIn, and we'll certainly share your account for you, is just the advocacy for the integration, the deeper integration of global mobility with payroll. And in most organizations, it is pretty much together, but sometimes it can get dripped over into finance and then it gets distant. But I actually think you're right. And I would even take it a step further and say, like, what else? What about the integration to HR? Because I think there's a lot of lockstep needing to happen when HR decides they want to hire or they want to move an executive or someone or a person somewhere. There needs to be a lot of coordination because there's just so many moving parts. But talk about that integration part, because I know you're very opinionated about that.
Yes, I'd actually been doing some work on it this week.
And how do we reduce the fear? Why was I so scared?
Fear
I don't
factor?
know. Yeah, I was fearful. I was scared.
It's across the board. And I've seen that for 15, 20 years. The word, and I'm on WhatsApp groups and everyone's like, Catey, come on, what do I do with this? And I don't know why obviously we're always fearful of the unknown. And the legislation is complex, but there are a lot of similarities across countries in terms of the fundamental basics of how items are taxable, what's subject to Social Security, but they think all the other things. So, for example, the 183-day rule, for example. There's no problem, right? No tax, no nothing. And then I go, but wait a minute. Does that person have the right to work in that country? Oh, no, we've sorted out that visa and we've got them an employment contract in France.
Yeah.
And they're, from Peru. Right, well, we've instantly got a problem there then, which is fine. But they are then an employee. They are economically employed in France. So it's all these things that, to your point, the integration piece, and I haven't seen any technology yet that maps that whole
I know where you're going with this. Yep.
Of, right, HR get a request for, Pete, you want to go and work in New Zealand, 10 months. Marvelous. Great idea. And then you go to your HR advisor and they go, yeah, well, on the surface, don't see a problem with that. Yeah. And you're going to come back to the US and you'll be worldwide tax in the US. So, hunky-dory. Great. And taxable in
it's
New
so simple.
Zealand. So simple. And then what happens is they give you the letter and they get from a mobility side and they think, well, we'll say 6 months because there's a tax treaty.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's no issue, right? There's going to be no tax. So we'll just give you a contract. And then we find, well, it's the visa piece and it's all these things and no one thinks about how to document that workflow. And from a technology perspective, there's nothing going, right, we've made a decision here. What does that need to do over here? What decisions need to be made? What's the risk?
Yep.
And also,
I agree.
Companies don't think about, because sometimes you need to have a process within a company that says, okay, you look at it from a traffic light approach, right? You say, well, 30 days in this country, it's okay. We'll say that, that's all green. And then if we're getting into 6 months or plus, that's a red. And, but even companies aren't really doing that because also whose responsibility is it to make these decisions on mobility? Is it HR? Is it tax? Is it finance? Is it talent?
Right.
And there's all these bum fights that go on. And I see this.
Yeah. I always saw it come from the business side, HR, in legal, often, kind of giving us direction. But I want to come back to that because and maybe Julie, I'd love your lens too. Like, let's talk about this issue that you just said about the maturity of the tech out there. You're probably seeing a lot of the systems from the practitioner side from a lot of different viewpoints. And Julie, I know you're helping people implement them, and I know what the vendors show and tell us. And I do think that the HCMs, at least the larger enterprise HCMs, are particularly getting better at handling the contingents, handling internal and global mobility, and having, in some cases, in various mixed forms, global payroll capability that can then go and do the other parts. But I still feel like when I talk to customers that I still hear that largely shadow payrolls and expat payrolls are being calculated outside the system by something else.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you're, to your point, like who is kind of leading right now when it comes to that, and what do you think is missing in the market? Just that connectivity of all of that, sort of the, I guess the orchestration, Julie, like we talk about leaves.
Yeah, I think some of the challenge, like I'm probably not as
and the
quick.
service providers involved, right? Sorry.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah.
I'm not as quick of a convert to the whole idea of being closer integrated yet, because I think the provider markets are very different, right? And the volume and scale that you're working with, this level of complexity on. And so a lot of even just your top leading payroll providers, that do global payroll or do domestic payroll, they don't typically have the same acumen for shadow payrolls. And so it's not their sweet spot. There's a different
Some
niche
do.
for that.
Yeah.
And some of the other, executive and mobility issues that go along with people moving from place to place have a different provider ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
That is more cued into the tax challenges and data needs, and even the movement and relocation type stuff. And it does still tend to pertain, even though we've gotten a lot more mobile in the last years, it does still tend to pertain to a small, select volume of employees. Now, do I think ideally we should be able, it seems that bare minimum, like we ought to be able to do a better job of integration and moving data and having things talk to each other, right?
Don't forget, the majority of this is being underpinned by the big four, and those are proprietary systems.
That's right.
And they are outside, and you're right. And they
That's right.
should, and they do, most do. I know Deloitte integrates. I'm sure PwC does, EY, but they're largely the third party. And that's where I think that handoff is still going to be, is still choppy.
Yeah. And Catey will probably tell us too, there's a whole different lens when you're looking at through the lens of, the payroll, tax, finance implications and compliance implications of all of that. That's very different than coming at it through the HR lens of things. And not everyone is equally good at, connecting those dots. Finance is a different ERP system usually, completely. Tax is its own monstrosity that scares the bejesus out of people, right? And so there are really tightly needed integration across these things. And yet the ecosystem of stakeholders and the technologies that they use is just not wired for it, it seems. And that's probably why it's such a passion for you, right, Catey? And why you just want to unravel it and make it better.
Yeah. And the integration's more than systems. I'd love your point of view on that, Catey.
When you think about Go Mobility, it is so complex because you've not just, when you're thinking about, there's multiple vendors in the mix. You've got, and then each of those vendors, when you're looking at data integration in terms of what's taxable, so expenses, cultural awareness training, and thinking about, because you need to, from the Go Mobility piece, or the team that manage the Go Mobility piece, they're focused on the service of the vendors to make sure that experience for the assignee as a smooth and can enable them to achieve the ROI, which is essentially the reason why they're going on assignment. They don't want to have the hassle or the pain of, how do you set up a bank account? How do I make sure my tax is correct? What do you mean that I have to complete this diary for KPMG or PwC and keep the receipts for my relocation and thousands of receipts? And you don't want that. So you want to make that as seamless as possible. So the mobility side of things, most teams don't like the tax and the payroll side of things, right? They won't understand it. They're fearful of it. But the vendor management piece and making sure the assignee experience is great and managing fantastic policies and implementing new tools from the things like Assignment Pro, which is a tool that I always used, for like 10 years. Really great tool, owned by a company called Equus over in the US.
Yep.
Really, really great tool. And when you think about integration, actually, that's one tool that can, for example, create your balance sheet and map things like your expenses and what's taxable and what's not. But the engine, for example, as far as I'm aware, was always Deloitte. Don't know if that's changed. So it had a robust engine in it. But then you've got, what happens is then the team create a balance sheet and a payroll instruction out of their tool. And then that gets, flipped over to payroll. Oh, there you go. Boom. You know how to read a balance sheet, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, no. And then you've got different tax years. And then, what we offsetting and what data you actually saying you're going to deploy that person. They don't think about those complexities. And what happens is it's given 2 weeks before a start date or after. And suddenly the payroll team's like,
crisis.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think HR puts it through the country of origin lens, right? If the headquarters is in the UK, their lens on the next country is the UK, right? Or US. We're guilty of it, right? Here.
And
so
different companies have multiple approaches. They can do host-based payroll.
Yes.
So post, everything, Yep. Or you've got tax equalized, and you've got things like, what record do you keep in the HR system?
Yes.
For salary, for example, because that's the salary review figure. But sometimes then, are you offsetting that for what we call salary sacrifice or hypothetical tax? And that reduces the base. So it's all these complexities.
That's where I think the communication and collaboration with, HR and legal to make that decision for the company, right? Because payroll can't make that ultimate decision. They can guide and they can suggest, but legal has to say, this is the way we're going to do it.
And you'll be amazed at the lack of involvement of legal team.
Well, and they need to interpret, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Katie, I have a combination of things that I think I see most often. And I'd be curious to know if this is, kind of what you typically encounter or where you think things are evolving. I most often see if folks are even thinking payroll in some multi-country fashion. There's provider or providers for that, but they're very nearly sticking to home country payrolls and not host. And they may pay them if somebody gives them something to pay, right? If there's an input or an entry that payroll can just process. Okay, great. And then there's kind of the tax and like the true mobility expat type activities, right? That you might find the Big Four involved in, and they're doing the estimates and they're doing the tax, the tax equalizations, and they're providing all of the nitty gritty stuff to whoever needs to be processing the payroll, and sometimes to both home and host countries. And then HR just kind of does its own thing and hopes that they all work out in the middle. Sometimes, they have to have a record, and maybe they, need to do some special things for them if there's compensation statements or, or other bits. And usually I find like a mobility person or a very small mobility team of specialists that have that energizer bunny fearless DNA, right? And they're the ones collaborating all of these pieces coming together. Is that kind of the usual construct that you see? Is there something that we should be thinking about differently, or a movement that you think would, just take things to the next level in how those job duties and roles are distributed typically?
A global mobility movement.
And it's funny because in the roles going back a few years, I was the mobility person from the payroll, the tax, the policy, creating all that from both the global payroll, domestics, and all that, and managing the Big Four relationship and the mobility team, and bringing it all together so that instructions from the Big Four to the payroll, they actually make sense. So everything makes sense to the end user, because I would find, you say about, yes, the Big Four, they give the instructions, the home, the host, but actually they don't necessarily, they don't talk to the payroll team. They're getting it on.
They pass a file.
And the letter, but they don't actually go, well, actually this person's got this tax code and this nuance. Do you know what I mean? Like what we call a K code. So they're like, oh, hang on a minute. Whoa, that changes things drastically. or they don't get that complete information. So what I've always said is you need, when you're having, it's a bit like a new country, right? And you've got new country implementation. You think about all your stakeholders that need to be involved in something, and you make sure that they're involved and that everything they need, everyone gets their piece and gets to be heard.
Yeah.
And then you create a more streamlined and efficient process. So irrespective of whether the person's gone, oh, do you know what? We just deployed that person yesterday. You've already got the procedures and the processes and the relationships in place that can go, right, that's fine. PwC, we need this by, this date, 3 days time. We've got the policies clearly aligned. You understand our payroll engine, what we need, how we need it, the format, the template, all that great stuff.
Yep.
And now with, can integrate from there. There's like KPM, a lot of them have got proprietary systems that you can actually integrate the numbers if you've mapped them to your payroll system. So there is that now. There is a lot of improvements, but there are still nuances that...
You said something there about just sort of payroll finding out, right?
Yeah.
Do you think it's like, and that's my experience, like oftentimes it's just sort of like, oh, you got to, now we had a dedicated expat expert embedded in our team that led and handled all that and coordinated everything. Yeah. But I have seen where it is disjointed and expats are sort of thrown over the fence at payroll. Do you think that that's like, should companies, and I think that HR kind of has to do this, but in bigger companies, sometimes the business is directing the need for a talent in a certain place based on what they're doing. But is there a need for a global mobility strategy? And is that a talent strategy, really, obviously, and then a compliance strategy to underpin that, or compliance readiness to underpin that strategy?
Yeah, but it has to be a team, collective collaborative effort. And if you don't involve all those stakeholders and those key teams, then it's going to fail automatically. It's like any project implementation, because payroll is a key stakeholder within the mobility piece. We're talking about risk and compliance, and also, if you want that assignment or cross-border work or whoever to actually have a positive return on investment, because these assignments are expensive, right?
Yeah.
So you don't want to, excuse my language, but fuck up the pay because that's catastrophic.
Yeah, table stakes.
Because it's worse. So you instantly create stress for the individual, risk credibility of the whole payroll, mobility. So as long as you're aligned and then you have a clear policy, a clear strategy, and as I always say, the right talent in the right places, i.e. the knowledge. So yes, a lot of companies perhaps can't afford to have, a huge mobility team, but if you've got clear communication between the payroll, the HR, the mobility team, the finance, and you from a cultural perspective or company vision, if you establish that at the start and you make that the underpinning rule of the company, that we will have open and transparent communication and empower individuals to make decisions collectively that everyone is comfortable with, then you won't have all these breaks in communication. And that's where everything falls down. It's when people go off or they are fearful of asking questions. They think they're right. And rather than pestering someone, I'll go off and do my own thing. I think this is okay.
Yeah.
But feeling empowered to actually ask rather than just do and then create the problem.
Yeah. I've seen companies that are really good at internal mobility and global mobility kind of in tandem. And I think that's and it's typically been like the bigger tech companies. Like I think Google was pretty good at this, like from my experience of working around with Google and seeing what they did. And I'd say, maybe even GE I've read a lot of great case studies on how GE leveraged internal mobility for talent, as a talent channel, and global mobility was part of that, obviously, in some cases. But I think you can be really good at it, and now more than ever, like I feel like you have to be good at this, especially if you're a bigger organization, to really maximize your talent, and that's a whole other show, right, on skills and skill inventories and on and knowing what you have and what you don't and what you need and what you will need and predicting what you will need. But I think internal mobility and global mobility go hand in hand with being able to put those skills in the right place at the right time. And if you can't execute on that, you're going to jeopardize that agility that you've potentially created for yourself. So there's such a lockstep engagement that needs to happen between HR and payroll and legal on this to make sure that you get it right. And I think it's important to have a good the right partner and a good flow of collaboration with them too.
It's so critical.
Yeah.
For many folks, it's a scale situation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if your company doesn't have the scale that supports, a dedicated position or, some sort of streamlining or technology enablement, right? Then you do have to, rely on collaboration and, some really smart cookies on your team to work it out and pull it together. And I feel like this is something that we see, progress, the most progress being made on by folks that literally have, dozens to hundreds, of mobility folks, where it begins to get unmanageable. And what I see in the sourcing world is a lot of times you're not looking to do any sourcing until you have a certain amount of scale. For some of these things. And Pete, maybe that's where the EORs come in, right? The employer of records.
You read my mind. I wanted to ask you that, Catey, like just, kind of thinking back to, before global mobility of past and global mobility kind of now. What do you see? What are you seeing in terms of just trends as far as the EOR model, the global EOR model coming into play around and with maybe as a synergy with global mobility?
I mean, it's funny because I implemented one of the first EORs probably about 13 years ago. So and it was relatively new, very expensive, right? It was like $1,500 a month and it was relatively new. People were a little bit reluctant because one of the issues within the EOR structure is, does it mitigate what we call the permanent establishment risk of a company? A little bit grey.
The business nexus.
Yes. So whether actually does it remove the ultimate that the individual or the company that's deploying the individual, say from the UK to France, does that mitigate the risk that actually they'll have a corporate presence and actually end up having to pay corporate tax?
Yeah.
So that relationship has always been a little bit fragile. However, I think when we're then talking about, we're going outside then of global mobility in terms of traditional sense. Because actually, I think in the past 4 years, we're seeing a lot more companies looking at their markets internationally because of the talent, particularly, IT, engineering, fintech. Do you know what I mean? Everyone, even manufacturing, the media industry are utilizing a lot more overseas staff and thinking that people can work anywhere because of this whole remote working and everything was great because there were relaxations from a lot of the tax tax authorities. And then suddenly, those relaxations have gone. So there's rules now, right? So, and there's, particularly with the UK leaving the EU, there's immigration, there's a lot more complexity. But with that, I'm even doing it with one of my clients now where they've got a lot of freelance workers that are actually more deemed employees. And actually the only solution is go and register your company. Very expensive, potentially, or utilize an EOR. And actually, even from a solution perspective and cost viability, it's a great option. I think I've seen so much growth in the EOR space over the last 3 years. I mean, I'm a little bit on the fence. I will not lie that I think some EORs they don't have the right strategy and they are just going at it from a perspective of this is really easy. And we can just charge astronomical amounts of money. It's easy revenue.
Everybody's doing it.
Grow, and then we'll go and sell to one of the bigger ones. What a great business. However, they're non-compliant from the employment contracts. They're not delivering compliant payrolls. They're not thinking about vendor contracts and making sure they're compliant. They've got the wrong strategy. And and it's a bit disconnected in terms of the customer fronting side of things with the client and the employees versus the support functions. So there's massive disconnect there.
A lot of them are like a concierge middleware, and that's all they are really. And they're a mile wide and an inch deep in some ways, and there's just no depth to them. That was my rant and our podcast, the great EOR differentiation debate, because I think there is just so many, like, it's just, how do you, I mean, it's like, where's Waldo? You know, you look, it's, which one do you pick? They all look the same. But there are some good players out there that are doing it right. They are building from the ground up. They are really going at this very, very differently. And I think that I think EOR is both a human opportunity enabler, but also an org agility enabler, and it's a wonderful solution for strategy, executing a strategy, but also doing it in a way that keeps and protects and de-risks your business. And yes, it's expensive, but I think it gives you the opportunity to speed through a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy and investment that you would have to take in order to execute on that. And maybe even more important, obviously the access to talent, or the ability to accommodate some talent. That's priceless right now when everyone's sort of clamoring for the skills that are available. So I think long live EOR. I wish it would get deeper integrated into the business more, I think, maybe, and maybe even more the HCM. I know there's an issue with some of the commingling and that sort of thing, but I love the fact that it is playing well with global mobility. I think it obviously it is two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways, just a different vehicle, I suppose. But they do got to play nice. And I think they got to play also as a talent solution as well. I think they got to play with HR really closely. So all of that is very, very, very timely.
But that's an interesting
it's coming together.
You said about the talent piece, because actually what I see a lot of it, and you think you wouldn't, but when companies identify the need, oh, it's great talent and we're going to lose them if we don't operate an EOR, you'd expect the HR people and culture teams to be leading that relationship and that engagement piece, but often it's the tax, the finance, the payroll. They've identified that they're the tip of the mobility spear. It's just parked over here. And so I'm like, okay, that's fine. But actually it should be, it's a fun, it's a talent tool. And if you want to grow your business and you don't want to have the excessive cost of establishing entities, you know, it is an opportunity for that. But as you said, which one do you choose? Because that's a risk in itself. So you've got to have, and I don't think there's enough knowledge of a lot of the EOR space, and not, you know, because we know a lot about the payroll vendors and even on like the CIPP, GPA, on all those, you know, memberships there are. We know a lot about the HCMs and the payroll solutions, but the EOR space, not so much, other than, you know, your remotes, your deals, your Ripplings, those ones that everyone knows about. Some
I
more
think
than
I've
others
met
now.
A significant portion of many of them, or of the population, and advised many of them. And I think that it's very hard to find a lot of differentiation right now. But it's there. And look, don't just think that the small guys can't handle what you do. I've seen some great providers that are regional focused, that are purely stay in their lane, and they do an outstanding job. And many of the roads lead to them from the globals anyway. So give them that opportunity, but kick the tires, right? Know what you're buying, understand how the cake's made. All the analogies, I guess, use all of the analogies you want, but make sure you understand what you're getting, because there is a risk to this is a risky game, doing this service. So Catey, sorry, go ahead, Julie. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, you know, you made a very truthful comment, which is a lot of the providers, they don't seek analyst advice, right? And they're not really advised. They just go it alone. But the same is true of clients. So, you know, your HR buyers, your HR payroll finance, wherever it sits, right? That organization, there is quite a bit to deal with from an operating model perspective, and just sorting out how those escalations, handoffs, touch points, data movements need to happen. And I liken it a little bit to what years ago was the great unknown of handoffs, which was onboarding. And, in recent years, there's an awful lot in the market that has happened to make sense of onboarding and the handoffs with IT for credentials, with, for keys, for, everything that has to happen. And I think that's because of the scale of onboarding and the criticality of the experience. Here we have a similar issue, but it's with a different scale of employees. And the operating model is just a bungle. And I guarantee you that it's different for every company and it has its own unique flavor of crazy, a little bit like leave, leave administration, leave management. And it's an operating model opportunity from my perspective. And I will tell you that is not frequently advised either. So if folks really want to make something messy cleaner, like that's the sort of exercise that I think they should really think about undertaking.
Yep.
I'm saying that all the time. When you look at one little problem, you think, well, even how things are being mapped or coded from in a finance system and an expenses system, and make sure you've got integrations within your own internal systems. So you haven't got lots of data integrity issues, which creates more of the problem in the first place. And which for payrolls, to get that final, input, that's where it all falls down. So yes, have ownership and clarity on who is ultimately responsible for entering this data into this system and make sure people know how to do it. And that leave piece, oh my God, how many times have I seen Workday implemented by a company? Great, we're going to implement it. We don't have a project manager. We've had someone, we've agreed for 2 months to get some help. So that's all they paid for, thinking 2 months is going to be enough. Then they realize, the US, we've got it sorted in the US, but nowhere else. And so what happens is a very disengaged HR and payroll team outside of that, because it hasn't been thought about and it hasn't been mapped and it hasn't been configured.
Yeah.
So you've got this great tool and these great tech, but you haven't thought about how to make it work based on your company policies, your operating model, and invest in that. Otherwise, what is the point of implementing that technology to say, oh, great, we're a partner with Workday? What does that mean?
Catey, when is it the right time, like for a company at either size or complexity or whatever, to maybe create a global mobility center of expertise, a COE? I'm seeing more talk about COEs. Like right now, I'm exploring workforce management COE, and I'm just curious, what's your point of view on that for global mobility or internal mobility at all? And is there a right size? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question because, so for example, one of my clients that I've worked for I've been working for since December, they said, one part of the project is to look at the global mobility policy. Great. So then I looked at it and I said, well, that's okay. It's not particularly tax efficient and it's not quite aligned to what the company objectives are. And it's not great. But I said, well, what are you trying to achieve with that mobility policy? Who's moving? What's the objective? What does it look like now? What's it looking like going into the future? What are locations? What is your strategy from a talent perspective? What are you offering these opportunities for? And then the HR team and the payers are, well, I don't really know. We just have it there just in case, we need to deploy someone. And we've had 10 people over the past few years. So I said, so we just need you to, align on what's the best compensation. Is it just, so they said, because we just want to give like 30,000 net USD or GBP for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not tax efficient. And actually, is that giving the individual? So then I said, who's owning this? So whose decision is this? And do you want a dedicated resource to own this, to manage this? Do you want to implement a technology to help you achieve this in a more automated fashion? Well, we don't know. So I said, well, what's the point of creating a policy and a set of process documents if you're not aligned on what you want? So I think then what I've said is, said to them, go back and work out what is it that you want to achieve.
Yeah, the strategy.
Now. Yeah, and in 5 years' time, and then I can tailor what you need, but you can also then work out where this should sit within the organization.
Yeah.
Should it sit in, you've got a talent team, you've got HR ops, you've got a risk and compliance team. So you've got loads of where it could sit. But how does that work operationally? How does it work from a governance perspective? Have they got time, capacity? Have you got a headcount? What do you want to do? And so I said, go back and look at that. So in answer to your question, I think it depends on the appetite within the organization on how efficient and streamlined do they want to make something? Because ultimately, if you've got quite a lot of people where you're even having remote workers or people going here for 3 months, or, that's enough of a business case to wrap your arms around it to say, okay, actually, this is really a risk area for us.
Yeah, it warrants investment. Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
And but that's what I'm saying about people then having those relationships across the board to go, guys, we've seen this trend, we've seen these issues come up. Let's go up the chain to actually say we've seen this, because what I'm seeing across the board is, I'm seeing it with my client at the moment, I go, oh, so you've got all these people, oh yeah, we've said they can go to Sweden and stay there for 6 months because their aunt's, or, sick or something. I was like, okay. And I'm going through these conversations and asking, and then, oh yeah, there's another 10 of these. So I say, right. So then you go and speak to the CFO and the COO. Are you aware? Don't know what you're talking about, Catey. Like, this is news to me. And so what I'm saying is there isn't that communication going on.
Yeah.
And there isn't enough of the C-suite asking the right questions or creating the right culture that empowers people to go, I'm going to raise this without fear of me being seen as a problem maker, having, adverse consequence on your employment potentially.
Yeah.
But that comes from the culture and the strategy of the business.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds a bit like my payroll profession competence index, right? Relationships, communication, alignment with the strategy. I think this is the same thing. And I think you got to have this weaved into the talent model and the talent strategy and the compliance element of this. So, So, Catey, sorry, Julie, got anything?
No. I think you're just about to ask Catey some of our closing items.
I want to ask some prognosticating questions. I want to ask. I always ask. What's next? Like, what are we going to be talking about with global mobility in 2030, 2035, whatever, 2040? AI's here. Like, what do you think? Are we? What's in store for us in the future?
I think one of the changes that will make a massive impact is around the use of AI within immigration and doing those assessments, because at the moment that takes sometimes 6 months to get a visa through. That needs to in the US, for example, oh my God, what a nightmare.
Oh, right now,
nightmare. But we'll see what happens, because there's probably going to be no workers in any of those, the IRS or anywhere else. If he's going
I know, man. I tried to just get a control number on the document from when my grandfather entered America in the 40s, and it took me 14 months to get that, just to get the control number to get them to respond to the control number. It was crazy, and it was supposed to have been like an 11-month wait, so it was much much longer, and that was 3 years ago now. So I can't imagine what it might be today.
So that. And funnily enough, one of my friends has just sort of created a new sort of technology app, which is going live. And so that is really speeding things up. And it's being able to, extract information from things like HR databases into those tools. But even things like policies and letters with AI, we can just improve the speed of that. I think, from a payroll perspective. And
the knowledge, right? The knowledge for that. Look, we showed GPGIA, right? It's like having a lawyer right at your fingertips. It really is cool. And you can ask it and get the data right back to you to tell you how to make a great decision, a good, solid, data-driven decision about your mobility question. So it's, by the way, it's still complimentary if people want to check that out. GPGIA. They baited that. They showed that over at Unleashed this week as well. But that's the type of thing I think is really powerful for AI to do for this part of the world.
Yeah. I think we're going to see the continued need for, or people having the desire to work remotely wherever they want, or having that flexibility. So I think the technology and even what I'd love to see is, tax treaties evolving with that, and maybe having some more flexibility and relaxations around certain things to keep up with this new type of working. So it's not necessarily triggering tax liabilities.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone wants their chunk of money, right?
Oh, yeah.
No matter where you go. And we get that. But if we want to encourage this flow of talent and communication and knowledge globally, I think there has to be some evolution from the tax treaties perspective.
Yeah.
And just simplifying things.
See.
Like, I get it all the time. Like, someone's coming, you've got a company that's hired a non-resident worker in the UK. How do I pay them? Like, that's a key question that comes to me every week from someone. What do I do? And then Tika, no, because you've never been resident. Like, we don't need to make it so complicated.
My hope in this is that I'm hoping that AI too is going to help not just our government, because we desperately need it, but all governments to really, at Greece, for example, you want to talk about not digital, digital, right? It would make everyone's life so much easier if more of the government agencies were mandating electronic payments and electronic reporting and electronic interactions and correspondence and integrations to things, because I just think there's just so much effort spent on both sides.
Yeah.
And that's a big lift sometimes for the payroll teams, especially when you have gnarly global mobility or just inquiries and just the stuff that comes with more entities poking around your business. And so that could be a lot easier if everybody was handshaking with the same digital maturity, I think.
And I think we're
a long way off.
I think we are
a long way off. In America, we are a long way off.
You want to kind of like take a gun and blow your head off because it's absolutely nuts. I'm trying to sort out my VAT tax return because the HMRC decided to do something wrong, and to try and fix it, I have to spend so much time. They're like, oh yeah, it's a mistake.
Yeah.
But for me, that's what I'm saying. The HMRC and all these I'm literally spending weeks and weeks of my time, and everything. And companies are doing that.
Yeah.
What an inefficient use of
time. Just a waste. Yeah.
When we say to empower payroll and get people, to say their voice and hear their voice and do all these things, well, we've got to get away from, even the fact that I've got all these pieces of paper sent to me in the
Printed.
post.
Yeah. Oh, mailed. Yeah.
Like that's,
Yes.
It's absolutely ludicrous that we're still going through this with the amount of technology growth and AI at our fingertips.
I know.
It's
exciting
to change, and I think it will. But I think tax authorities, they just need to have that. They also need to have the integration globally.
Yeah.
So it's not so long to wait for tax returns and foreign tax credits.
Yeah. You'd think they would want to do it just to speed the money up, but
exactly. Cash flow. You want the cash, so get it in.
Yeah. Catey, look, this has been so fantastic. I really appreciate it. You answered so many cool questions for me, and I think this is a fascinating world that is going to become every company problem eventually. At least those that can hire beyond their, borders of where they live. I think this is going to be a thing that you're going to have to deal with on some scale, whether that's EOR, whether that's large scale global mobility, whether that's long tail payroll. And I think the complexity of all that is very, 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 very serious. You can't underestimate it. So, man, I'm glad that people like you lean into it, because it is it's terrifying to me. And I always appreciated the folks that do that. And Catey, congratulations on ExPaytriate. I know you're going to do well. You're such a brilliant mind, and you've got, who wouldn't want to talk to you with all your energy? I love it to death. Where can folks get connected with you, and we'll share those links for you?
Honestly, it's been such a joy talking to you both, honestly.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
I feel energized from this.
Hey, that's what we do here. We're just trying to share
the love. Share the love.
Yep. Share the knowledge. We can't keep it to ourselves.
No, we can't. And that's one of the key things about my business, is encouraging people to, affordably get access to knowledge and share it and circulate it.
I love it.
Be empowered yourself to be the expert you want to be.
So how do folks get in touch with you? Give us your links. Tell us your links.
So the website address is www.expatriate, which is EXPAYTRIATE.co.uk.
Nice.
Honestly, I'm so proud, and I've created this myself.
I love it. I've seen it.
It's so exciting.
It is. Congratulations. And LinkedIn, I know you're on LinkedIn. Anywhere else we could get you?
I'm a big fit. I'm on my Instagram. I'm on TikTok. I'm on everything, honestly.
Perfect. Give me your links. I want you to shoot me the links offline and I'll share them in the description. Make sure everybody gets a hold of you.
I will.
Yeah. Well, look, Catey, thank you so very much. And thank you to everyone for joining us as usual. And we will be back very, very soon after we get done with lots of trips, lots of events. We're going to have some news and we'll, keep you guys posted.